Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay. It's a true pleasure to be able to welcome Vanessa Teague from the University of Melbourne as people come in. Vanessa got her PhD at Stanford about, 10 years ago, roughly? Something like that.
6 years ago.
6? Yeah, that's recent.
I think so.
A lot of work in 6 years. Anyway, she's done a lot of great work on voting and is rapidly becoming a thorn in the side of the Australian government, which is a very good thing, and the issues there. And she's going to be here for the next week. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know or talk to her directly if you'd like to chat up until Friday. And she's going to be telling us today about some of her work on pretty good democracy. So, welcome. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about pretty good democracy, which is an attempt to do a decent job of secure internet voting. This is joint work with James Heather from the University of Surrey and Peter Ryan from the University of Luxembourg. And I'm going to talk about it at a fairly high level, so if you'd like any more technical details or if you have any other comments or questions, you're very welcome to interrupt as I'm going along and ask. So let me start off by asking, what are the security requirements for internet voting? Right? Think about what internet voting might look like. We've got a collection of voters, each at their own little PC. They enter their vote into the PC. The PC transmits the vote across to some kind of server. The server announces the server adds them all up together and announces a result. It's really simple, right? We all know that computers are really good at adding up lots of numbers very fast and very accurately. What could go wrong? Well, just to motivate this a little bit, let me take a little example from my current hobby of stirring up trouble at home. This is a little report from the person who was paid to do a security audit on a large internet voting system that was just deployed in the state of New South Wales in their previous state election. They took 47,000 votes, which is quite a large fraction of the vote. And unfortunately, after polling day, it was observed, surprise, surprise, that the software output didn't quite match the printed output of the same system. Investigation determined blah, 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 blah. You don't have to read that very carefully. There were 43 ballot papers affected. They chatted about it for a while, and finally, the Electoral Commissioner made a determination on the affected votes, for which I read, the Electoral Commissioner made up something or other that looked plausible given what the system had reported. This is all of the publicly available information about this incident. I don't have any idea what actually happened. I'm intending to try and find out when I go home. But let's just say that I probably don't need to demonstrate to this audience, but if anybody wanted to be convinced that security issues for electronic voting really matter, here's an example. Right? 43 votes were affected, at least 43 votes were obviously affected. Who knows how many other votes were affected by the same bug? The Electoral Commissioner made up something. And here, this is my favourite sentence. This issue has been fully documented. So it's all okay, don't worry, the issue has been fully documented. I've asked for the documentation. It's not publicly available, but it exists. So back to my little picture. Especially if I can remember how to get this back up here. Okay, back to my little picture. What could go wrong? Well, just about everything, actually. Just about every kind of step in this process could be subject to some kind of a security problem. Whether it's the correct recording of the vote at the client machine, whether it's the transmission of the vote, whether it's the identification of eligible voters, the correctness of the tally, whatever, the behaviour of the government afterwards, all but the last don't inside the scope of this talk. Okay, so here's a brief, informal kind of a description of what the security requirements for the system, for an ideal system, might be. Really, I think there are kind of two classes of properties that you might want out of a system. One I've called verifiability, by which I mean a proof of getting the correct answer. So that the authorities or people who hack into the authorities' computers or whatever can't manipulate the counting process. And so this might include a public demonstration of things like that only eligible voters actually voted, that each voter's vote was cast in the way that that voter actually intended, which is something that obviously only the voter themselves can check, that each vote was counted in the way that it was cast, and finally that the votes were all properly tallied. So there should be some degree of publicly available evidence of the correctness of the recording and transmission and tallying of the votes. And as always in these kinds of crypto protocols, we want to get the strongest kind of guarantees based on the weakest kinds of assumptions. So there's a pile of literature all about electronic voting, and the literature varies a little bit on the strength of the different assumptions that they make. Sometimes there are papers that get a full zero-knowledge kind of proof of correct tallying. But obviously, the proof that the client machine actually encrypted the vote in the way that the voter has intended to do it is a complicated kind of issue requiring a lot of human interaction. It's not a crypto problem, it's really a problem of the interaction between the person and the machine. So that's verifiability. The second kind of property is a privacy property, which is obviously a fundamental part of voting. I think that privacy for voting is really just a means to the end of getting the correct answer. Right? It's not like one of these fundamental privacy issues. Maybe you could argue that it is that way, but privacy is necessary for voting in order that people vote truthfully and then the system gets the right answer. So the crucial insight in the literature about election privacy, which is due to Josh Benelow from quite a few years ago when this field really first started, was that just getting the system to maintain privacy against a passive kind of voter isn't actually good enough for voting. Vote privacy has to be guaranteed even if the voter wants to cooperate with the coercer and try to prove how they voted. Because if they can prove how they voted, then they can be bribed or bullied into proving how they voted, and so effectively they don't have a private vote. So this property is called receipt-freeness, and it's very, very hard to achieve. In particular, if you use your own machine to encrypt a particular value, then you can, and if the encrypted value is subsequently published, then you can prove how you voted if you remember the randomness that was used to make the encryption. So achieving both of these things is really hard, especially for remote voting. If you think about it, it's relatively easy to achieve one or the other. It's relatively easy to achieve verifiability. You can write everybody's vote in the clear on a public website. Everybody can go and check that their vote is correctly recorded. Everybody can do the tally. It's relatively easy to achieve privacy. You know, everybody telephones the Electoral Commission, tells them how they want to vote. The Electoral Commission does a completely secret tally and tells everybody the answer. What's challenging is to get both of these properties to a reasonable degree at the same time. Most solutions use what is commonly called a bulletin board, which you could really just think of as a website with some extra properties, but is probably better described as a public authenticated broadcast channel with memory. In other words, there's broadcast, everybody sees the same thing, everybody signs what they send and everybody can check the signatures of what's been broadcast, and nobody can delete from it. Okay, so here we go. So I think it's fair to say that for simple voting systems in a polling station, we have a pretty good idea of how to get all of these properties with a pretty decent, based on pretty decent, reasonable assumptions all at the same time. But for remote voting, we know how to achieve some of the properties, but we really don't know how to achieve all of them with reasonable assumptions at the same time. So this work that I'm going to present is somewhere on the best point of a trade-off among strong verifiability and strong privacy. There are other systems out there that provide better verifiability. There are other systems out there that provide stronger privacy. Pretty good democracy provides a pretty good trade-off under pretty decent assumptions compared to other things in the literature. Okay, so here's the plan of the rest of my talk. First of all, I'm just going to give an overview of the basic form of pretty good democracy without going into too many of the gory technical details. I'm going to explain roughly how it works at a high level, and importantly, I'm going to describe what its security properties actually are. Then I'm going to go on to extensions to more expressive voting schemes. So my corner of the world is looking at secure voting systems, specifically from the point of view of extending them to the very complicated voting system that we use in Australia. So the second part of the talk is going to be about how to extend the basic form of PGD to Australian voting and San Francisco voting and whatever else you like. Okay. So the inspiration for this work comes from code voting, which is an idea by David Schaum that goes back about 10 years. And it's really a very simple idea, but it provides a lot of very strong security properties. Very nice. It also has a lot of big gaps that you'll be able to see when I describe it. So the idea is, before the election, each voter gets a code sheet. Each candidate gets a unique vote code and acknowledgement code, and these are different for every different voter. Yeah?
Slightly off subject, but I believe 5% of males are red-green colorblind.
Oh, you don't like my my picture. Fair enough. Well, it's just that, as an example, these are sort of universal, culturally independent kind of party names. So I wanted to avoid stirring up more political sentiment than necessary. You can write, donkeys and whatever it is. But yes, okay, fair enough. So it's a joke that 95, but not everybody gets. Sorry. Anyway, you can read it. So where were we? Oh yes. So you get a randomly generated code for each candidate, for each voter, and the assumption is that these are supposed to be secret from everybody else, where everybody else is not real well defined. But the idea is, if you want to vote for, say, the Green Party, you submit the vote code 7846 and you type that into your computer and you wait for it to return the acknowledgement code 6794. And if that all goes smoothly, assuming that your sheet was delivered securely from the right source and that it was kept secret, you now know some things. You know as a voter that your code was sent to the correct server. So we're stopping the attack where the client machine tells you that it voted for you, but actually just didn't bother sending the vote. Furthermore, since the acknowledgement code actually matches a particular candidate, you know that it sent the correct vote, but it sent a vote for the correct candidate. And I guess you could argue that actually you know that anyway, because the whole point is that the client machine doesn't know any of the other codes. So the client machine doesn't know how to cast a vote for anybody other than the one candidate that you carefully tell it. So that's all fine so far. As far as it goes, that's all fine. But you can see there are a couple of big gaps compared to the list of requirements from a couple of slides ago. If the server or the people running the election misbehave, then it's all over. There's no protection in this protocol against the authorities running the server just deciding to take your code for a green vote and counting it for the fuzzy party instead. There's no evidence that they behaved properly. There's nothing you can do about it afterwards. Secondly, there's this big and strong assumption that the code sheet has to stay secret. If your client machine somehow learns the codes, or if somebody sitting between your client machine and the authorities knows your codes, then again, it's all over. And if somebody can substitute the vote code that you send out, and then they can substitute the acknowledgement code that comes back from the authorities. So the aim of Pretty Good Democracy is to deal with this first issue, that we're going to get some evidence from the authorities who tally the election that they actually recorded the correct vote for you and that they tallied the votes correctly. We still have this big assumption that the code sheet has to stay secret, which I don't really know how to deal with. All right, so here we go. So a brief summary of where we get to with PGD is the idea is to combine the code voting that I just mentioned with a verifiable tally. It provides high privacy and integrity guarantees, and in particular it protects against an untrusted voting client. So we don't have to rely upon the client machine to record the vote that you asked them to. Each voter gets a sheet of codes, fairly similar to what I'll show before, and I'll show exactly how it's different in a minute. One vote code for each candidate, and then just one acknowledgement code for the whole code sheet. So we don't split the different acknowledgement codes. I'll explain why in a minute. And you can see that I've said that the voter receives this via a secure channel, where secure is in scare quotes, somewhat deliberately, because the truth is that implementing such a secure channel is very difficult. And in particular, the commonly envisaged kind of thing with this sort of scheme is that they'd be mailed out in the mail, which obviously has issues. So a coercer who can intercept your code sheet on the way to you can obviously just steal your code sheet and cast votes instead of you. But again,
Just demand to see your code sheet.
yeah, or just demand to see your code sheet. Yeah, exactly. So even if, right, that's a good point. So even if you do have a secure kind of delivery mechanism where you get to go to a special station and collect your code sheet and be sure that you got it and so on, the coercer can still intercept you beforehand and demand to see it. So this is, I don't know how to get rid of that assumption either. But now still voting again is very simple. You enter the code for your chosen candidate and you wait until you get the acknowledgement. So here's what the code sheet would look like. The only difference as far as the voter is concerned is that there's only one acknowledgement code for each candidate. But there's a lot going on the bulletin board that some voters can bother to check if they want to, but not everybody has to. So the way it works is you send your code in the clear to the server. The server encrypts it and posts it on the bulletin board. And then you wait to get the right acknowledgement back that matches your code sheet. So there's a few design decisions here that probably deserve a bit more justification. Firstly, we decided to get rid of the separate acknowledgements for different separate acknowledgement codes for different candidates because we couldn't actually see a plausible attack model in which it made a big difference. We figured that if somebody stole your code sheets, it was all over anyway. If somebody knows your codes and sits upstream of you between the authorities and the voter, they can substitute the vote code and then the acknowledgement code on the way back. So having a bunch of different acknowledgement codes doesn't really seem to prove much. We thought that this preserved the crucial property about codes, which is, the two crucial properties about code voting being firstly that the client machine cannot cast a vote for a different candidate because it doesn't know the different candidate codes other than the one that you entered. And secondly, that if you get the correct acknowledgement code, that's good evidence that your vote was sent to the right set of authorities. Rightio, so that's what the code sheet looks like. So now the interesting bit is the correct tallying that goes on the bulletin board, which is about to get a little bit more hideously complicated.
Why do you have to encrypt it before posting it to the bulletin board?
Because if you send it, okay, it's for receipt-freeness, so for privacy. I guess I'm probably. Is that going to be on the next? This is going to be 2 slides further down. So the idea for privacy is, if the coercer comes to you and asks for your code sheet before you vote, then it's all over. But what we can achieve is privacy after the fact. So after you've voted, assuming that the coercer wasn't there watching you, you now have no evidence about what vote you cast.
Can you just shred the code sheet after you vote?
Can you just shred the code sheet after you vote? Yes. You certainly could. And so you're saying, why is encryption on the bulletin board better than just a universal instruction to shred your code sheet afterwards? Okay, so let me try out the following. We can think it through as we go. I'm tempted to say, suppose that somebody makes an advertisement of saying, I'll come after the election and pay for any code sheet that hasn't been shredded. And I guess what you would say to that is, well, then the same person advertising it can advertise for code sheets to be sent to them before the fact.
But if they don't have time to collect them beforehand, but they do have time to collect them afterward, and they say, if we show up and you can't supply us a code sheet, we're going to kill you, or we're going to have to take you.
Yeah. Nice. Look, it might be a little bit of a dubious argument. There's some kind of a coercer who who doesn't have time to ask for your code sheet in advance, but might have time to come and ask for it indefinitely afterwards. Is that thoroughly convincing? Not especially. Yeah, go ask a question while I try and think.
Anything like your own home, you need 1 or 2 witnesses anyway to make sure there's nobody standing behind you to watch you. So they might as well witness that you tore up the code and put it in the trash disposal.
I guess the assumption would be, what if you want to? What if you want to? What if you want to go back to your employer or your church or your trade union or whatever after the fact and prove that you voted in a certain way? Now, I would like to say that you can't do that with this system. Assuming that you kind of voted honestly in the first place. So the claim would be, assuming that you voted honestly in the first place and kind of ran the right protocol in the first place, then with this system you wouldn't be able to prove after the fact that you had voted in a certain way. And what you're saying is, well, suppose that voting correctly in the first place includes shredding your code sheet. Okay, all I can think of to say at the moment is it's just a little bit harder to shred your code sheet than to
achieves this receipt-freeness even against a misbehaving client, I think, in this sense.
Yeah, I mean...
If somebody pay me $1 million to vote for somebody, I can just don't shred it, and then I can prove I voted if not encrypted. But by encrypted, I kind of don't have that capability to misbehave anymore.
Yeah, that's certainly the intention.
Yeah, I think I guess that's the intention.
Yeah, so I guess we're arguing about exactly what the definition of, exactly what the security model is. I certainly think it's easier to be unable to prove afterwards how you voted given this design. And I'm happy to reopen the discussion afterwards about exactly how you define it and whether it wouldn't just be easier to shred your sheet.
I think it's a little bit easier to coerce without the encryption, because then it's just, I send you my code sheet, here it is, in some form, and you can check it. Whereas if it's encrypted, then you're going to have to change your client machine to remember the randomness, send stuff that way. So it's a simplification.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe it's not a fundamental thing, but it makes it easier to have the right status at the end of voting. Righto, so just in summary, integrity assumes the secrecy of the code sheet. I think I already said that. If somebody upstream of you knows your codes, then it's all over. Yeah, fire away, Melissa. The server. Yeah, okay, so that's a good...
Can you repeat the question or say it again?
So the question was, hang on, aren't we trusting the vote server to encrypt the correct value? And that's a good question, and the answer is, again, it depends on the assumption is that the vote server doesn't know the other codes. So it's kind of the same assumption as the assumption that keeps the client machine honest. If the vote server doesn't know the other codes, then they can encrypt some rubbish, which will be observable later, but they shouldn't be able to encrypt a different valid code because they don't know a different valid code. Yeah, good point, I should have said that. So integrity of the election assumes the secrecy of the code sheet. Otherwise, your client or the vote server or anybody in between can send a different code from what you wanted. Again, the ACK code authenticates the trustees to the voter, so you know your vote code got sent to the right authorities. And the design, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail later, requires a certain threshold of authorities to work together to decrypt the acknowledgement code and send it back. So the assumption is going to be it was all good as long as no more than this threshold of authorities colluded to return you your proper acknowledgement code without bothering to record your vote. So the proof is going to be that each vote is correctly registered, assuming that not more than a threshold of trustees collude to send you back the right looking thing without recording your vote correctly. And that's a weaker integrity guarantee than other things in the literature. But then we have this strong defence against a misbehaving client machine. And then the verifiable telling on the bulletin board is going to follow very familiar ground from the rest of this pile of literature, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but nice kind of standard crypto things involving zero knowledge proofs that you did the decryption correctly and that kind of stuff. All right, so I think I've said this already, but I'll say it again. So privacy is guaranteed assuming that the person trying to figure out your vote either doesn't observe the message that you send or doesn't see your code sheet. But obviously not both. In particular, your computer doesn't learn how you voted absent knowledge of the code sheet. And as we've just discussed at great length, it's receipt-free under reasonable assumptions, but it's not coercion-resistant if the coercer comes to you before the election. Yeah, that's the theory. So we can talk about that a little bit at the end. So I'm going to go at a high level past the gory details of exactly how the ballots are constructed and so on. You're welcome to ask me about it later, but I think we might go through it fairly fast so that I can get onto the more fun bits at the end. It's important to generate the code sheets in a distributed way so that no single entity knows all of the codes that were printed on a particular voter's code sheet. And so the paper contains a complicated distributed construction so that there's this nice construction on the bulletin board generating encrypted codes for each code sheet. The candidates are listed on the bulletin board in a random order with their corresponding codes written down beside them. So none of the entities involved in the distributed construction know which codes correspond to which candidates. Although obviously if they all got together they could figure it out. But again, the assumption is no more than a certain number of them collude. So on the bulletin board for each code sheet we have a nice list of encrypted codes. We have another encrypted value that's like the onion in pret-a-vote, if that makes any sense, but which just explains what the order is later. So you can decrypt the encrypted value and figure out which candidate is which along the list. So that's all beautifully done in a secure distributed way. But then we have to print them out on a sheet of codes, on a piece of paper. So the main privacy vulnerability is not in fact the threshold of people participating in the sophisticated distributed construction, but the printer. So I don't really know. Again, I would love to figure out how to get rid of this assumption, but unfortunately there's this nice fancy distributed construction and then all the data has to get sent to one printer, or you could send it to a few different printers and each print out a bit of it, but at some point it has to be printed out and sent to a person in readable form. Rightio. But importantly, this list of encrypted codes is going to be sitting on the bulletin board for each code sheet. And we're going to use that in the telling. Yeah.
I think they still used to print payroll checks with a printer that not supposed to show anything on the outside. A mechanical hammer hits a cardboard envelope inside which there is a carbon paper, beneath which there is the check, and that the check gets printed.
So nobody sees it on the way?
Nobody sees it until you open the envelope.
But the printer still has to know.
The printers have to know, but if they have no long-term memory, you power them down and they forget.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing makes some sense. Unfortunately, it's a proving a negative kind of a thing, right? So you could let election observers observe the nifty printer, but they couldn't observe that the information hadn't been leaked at some other point. I think.
I wonder if you have also the same number of printers attached to each distributed server, and then maybe threshold the pixel values of the image, and so each one of them will be garbage, but after the voter collect all of them and put them all together, it tells them the number.
There is a paper. There is a paper in either, is it EVT or Vote ID? I'm getting confused, but there's a paper upcoming in one of the voting conferences that uses invisible ink to do exactly what you just said, and the idea is they all get a bit of a share, and then they all print invisible ink, and then the ink becomes visible all at the same time. Yeah, it's an extension to Scantegrity. Yeah. Can you remember whether it's in EVT or Vote ID? Anyway, it's in one of them. That's fine. But in some ways you end up substituting kind of chemical assumptions for crypto assumptions. So there's I think it's debatable. It's an interesting problem, but it's not clear that that it's easy to solve. Oh, certainly not clear to me that it's easy to solve. Okay, good eye. So, just a brief overview of how voting works. The voter submits their code to their client machine. The client machine sends it to the vote server. The vote server encrypts it, posts it on the bulletin board next to this list of encrypted codes that we just so carefully generated in the last slide. Now, there's a set of trustees who share the election private key, and they have to figure out which of the codes on the list this newly submitted code matches without showing anybody else what the decryption is. And the tool that we obviously didn't invent but just pulled out of the literature is called a Plaintext equivalence test, for which the idea is there's a set of trustees who share the secret key, and they're going to perform a protocol which tells them whether two plaintexts match or not. The idea is supposed to be if they match, then they'll find out. If they don't match, then they'll get no information about the ratio or any other information about the contents. So the idea is that the trustees go through taking the submitted code and checking, using this plaintext equivalence test, which of the codes on the bulletin board it matches. And this gives them an index, and then we use the Prêt-à-voter onion to figure out which index matches that candidate. And then, having figured all that out and recorded it properly on the bulletin boards, the same group of trustees works together to compute the acknowledgement code and send it back to the voter. And then, as I said, there's a fairly standard tallying process that's really just the same as the Prêt-à-voter tallying process, which I'm leaving out, but which I'm happy to talk about if you like, involving all the good crypto protocol stuff, like some mixing and some zero knowledge proofs that you decrypted the right thing and this sort of thing. I'm going to skip the important details. You can ask if you like. Okay, so here's the summary of what we got. Good properties. A cheating client can't miscast or drop the vote unless the codes have been leaked. A coercer can't find out the vote afterwards unless they both saw your code sheet and observed the communications between your device and the authorities. And there's verifiable tallying in a fairly standard way. Okay, bad things. The coercer can steal your code sheet before you even bother voting. A colluding threshold of trustees can misrecord your vote. And integrity depends upon the secrecy of the codes. So there's the summary. And again, there are other internet voting schemes in the literature. There isn't, as far as I know, one that is strictly better than this, as in at least as good as this on all the criteria and strictly better on some. There are other schemes in the literature that have a stronger form of integrity and not quite as strong a form of privacy, or vice versa. But, oh yeah, far away.
Is it fairly straightforward to see why a colluding threshold can misrecord your vote?
Yes, because they can cheat on the test of which code matches up which thing on the list.
Okay.
So they can just kind of pretend that your encrypted code actually matched some other point on the list, and in that way they can cast it for somebody else. Or I guess they can just drop your vote altogether and send you the ACK code, which they can compute and not bother recording your vote at all.
In terms of stealing the vote in the mail, if you ever ask for a document for IDA, you'll find there are instrument defense analysis, the open end of the NSA.
Ah.
You find there are envelopes that cannot be opened and resealed without the damage showing for
really?
miles. Because that's the one thing I remember about the document I ordered. So you can certainly have envelopes that you open before you vote, and if they've been tampered with, everybody knows they've been tampered.
Oh, very good.
IDA standards.
Oh, well, there goes my analysis of the security of postal voting. There goes my analysis of the security of postal voting. Do you know how much they cost?
No.
Well, you can just get extra envelopes.
I'm sorry?
You can get extra envelopes.
Yeah, but if you
that's
print
the
the ballot on the inside of the envelope, right, then extra envelope won't do any good.
Print another one. You print another one on another envelope.
Okay. You have to, right. It's a big operation.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Good day. So I blithely promised that I don't talk for 45 minutes, but that's all right because I've got a whole hour. I'm going to talk about extensions to slightly more expressive voting schemes. So if there were details in the last thing that didn't make a lot of sense, you can sort of restart now because I'm going to change topics altogether and just look at the... So far we've made the standard American assumption that we were just choosing one candidate out of a list, right? But in fact, this is not the only way to cast a vote, and different countries in the world do very different things. I'm kind of motivated by the Australian example, which is not the only example of this kind of scary-looking ballot, but it's the example dearest to my heart, so here we go. If you vote in the Australian Senate, the ballot looks like this. You can either choose just one box above the line, like this. Right, straight ticket, exactly. So that's just sort of a straight party ticket. But if you're actually a thinking individual who wants to make up your own mind about your own vote, then you write below the line your preference ordering on all of the candidates who are listed. This is the first page. Here's the second page. So you have to fill in, there's usually, at least in my state, there's roughly 70 candidates. You have to fill in the numbers from 1 to 70 in the boxes. If you repeat a number, then they throw your vote in the bin. If you just skip a number, it's probably okay because they can kind of tell what ordering you intended. But as you can see, this is a user interface problem very different from the American example. So that's what motivates the second half of my talk.
Before you go,
Yeah.
why did you vote for the Labour Party get number 7 for livers for forests?
Oh, yeah, well, so much can be the sound of teeth gnashing as a result of which tickets the major parties choose can be heard throughout the election cycle. In fact, sorry, this is a bit of a diversion, but here we go anyway. This particular ticket is notorious, not because of putting Liberals for Forests 7th, but because of putting this person from the Family First Party 8th. So the Labor Party is the lefty party, right, like the Democrats. The Family First Party was this very far-right Christian values kind of, the Labor Party was here, the Conservatives were here, this person was over here, and he got a seat as a result of this ticket, which I hope motivated many Labor Party voters to write their own preferences below the line. But anyway, I digress.
Sorry, just a quick question. When you put a 1 for the party, are you effectively grading all those 1 and everybody else 2?
No, it's worse than that actually. When you put a 1 for a particular party ticket, you're saying, I'll have the total preference ordering that party wants. So they number all of the other parties in whatever way they would like.
And their own candidates.
Including their own candidates. So they put their own candidates first.
But in an order that they choose.
In an order that they choose, and then they put everybody else in some order that they choose.
Why can't, and somewhat trivial question, why can't you just put the same number for 2 candidates? Can't they just, that makes sense. I don't care about these 2 parties, the order of these 2 candidates.
Yeah, it makes sense as a voting preference, but because of the tallying algorithm, which is probably the subject of another good 20-minute talk, because of the tallying algorithm breaks in that case.
But yours probably Yours is going to be more general and would allow ties. And
Mine is more about the interface than about the tallying. I do have another paper about the tallying, but that's another story altogether. So ask me after the talk. The tallying is a story in itself. But for the moment, we're just kind of talking about, encrypting the vote, figuring out what you meant, and leaving the tallying to later. So at the moment, for the purposes of the next 10 minutes, a vote is a preference list on a possibly quite long list of candidates. So you can either think of it as being a list of candidates in order or a list of numbers after each candidate, like this is my third preference, this is my fourth preference, this is my 17th preference, and so on. So I want to extend this code voting idea to this form of voting. And to be perfectly honest, the real truth is nothing that I can think of is actually usable for the ballot that I just showed you. I tried. This is our best effort. I don't think you'd really use this for 70-odd candidates in order. However, there are quite a number of jurisdictions across the world that use sequential voting like that in a less extreme kind of form. For example, I believe in San Francisco you're allowed to write your top 3 candidates in order. The kinds of things I'm about to describe now would make perfect sense there. First preference, second preference, third preference, and then off we go. And similarly, lots of other places in the world use some kind of slightly different variant. Maybe you get 10 candidates and you get to rank some of them in order or something. That would work fine. 75 candidates, I just don't know how to do in any form. Okay, I think I've already said this. So each voter is going to be listing the candidates in the order of preferences. The obvious extension of the code voting or PGD is you just send off all your codes in order.
Are you concerned about the attack where I know some of your, I know like 69 of your orders and I'm trying to figure out the other one?
I want to deal with all of them, okay. Yes. So I don't want it to be easy to use a little bit of information to be able to manipulate. Yeah.
So if I look, so you're not going to post anything enough in the clear to, okay.
Yeah. Because that can make a big difference actually. In particular, it's very traditional in Australia to put the 2 major parties last.
Huh.
Just to kind of demonstrate that you hate them both. So where were we? Oh yeah, so each voter is listing all the candidates in the order of preferences. The obvious first thing that you might think of, I mean you probably wouldn't, but somebody might, is to just use code voting by sending off all the codes in your order of preference. You type them into your computer in the order that you like the candidates, and your voting client is supposed to send them off. Well, the obvious thing that's wrong with this is that a cheating client can just rearrange the order of preferences, send it off, rearrange your acknowledgement codes when they get back, when they're returned, and you would never know. So we have to do something slightly cleverer than just straight code voting in preference order.
For small numbers of votes, though, if you're willing to wait, if you only have to do 3, then you can just do that, right? Because you can wait for the act.
Yeah, that's my next slide. Look,
okay.
Yeah. So, idea A, absolutely. You just do it slowly. Send off your first code, wait for the act. Send off your second code, wait for the act. Absolutely right. And for a small number of preferences, it works fine. It might be a bit slow. It's all good, right? It's all good. But I'd like to do something a little bit faster. And in particular, this makes me a little bit nervous because I worry a little bit about the voters not understanding that they have to wait for the act before they send their next thing off.
Another disadvantage is if you make a mistake, you can't undo it. This would prevent you from saying, oh wait, let me submit a different vote.
Yeah, that's true actually. Yes. In fact, last time I voted in the Australian Senate, I had to tear out my ballot paper and go and get another one. So this happens. It's very easy to get confused with a long list of that many people. So yeah, very true. Okay, so the second most obvious idea, which again would work fine for a small number of candidates, I think, is just the obvious thing where you have a 2-dimensional table, right? So you have for each candidate for each preference, there's a code. And so say you want to vote checkered, fuzzy, green, red. You go, well, the code for writing checkered as my first preference is this 9521. The code for writing fuzzy as my second preference is this 3455, and so on. And then it really works exactly the same way as ordinary code voting. The assumption is your voting client doesn't know any of the codes for expressing any other preference, and so you can be assured that it all worked. All right, so the one clever idea in all of this, let's just skip that, we can come back to that. The one clever idea in all of this was this last protocol, which lets you vote fast, gives you one-dimensional code sheets, but it makes the acknowledgement checking really complicated. So the aim is to make voting simple and fast and assume that a small number of paranoid voters will bother doing the rather complicated thing they have to do to check their acknowledgements, and assume that if a sufficiently large number of voters bothers to check, then it's probably okay. So this is the trade-off. So here's how it works. The code sheet is going to look a lot like the PGD code sheet that I showed you back a ways. Right, there's going to be just one code for each candidate. There's the list of candidates is going to be written in a random order. And this is going to be important. So we're not only going to need that the codes are secret, we're going to need that the order of the candidates on your code sheet is also secret. And instead of having an acknowledgement code for each candidate, we're going to have an acknowledgement code for each preference. So there's going to be an acknowledgement code for the third preference, an acknowledgement code for the fifth preference, and so on. So the idea is, you as a voter, you send off your candidate codes in preference order. You just do the absolute obvious thing. You take your list of candidates and their corresponding codes, you write them down in the order that you like them, you type them straight into your computer and send them off. And if you're a lazy voter in a hurry, that's all you ever need to do. The second most lazy voters can wait to receive the acknowledgement codes and just kind of check that they look okay. The third most lazy, the paranoid voters can do the following. They wait carefully for the preference acknowledging codes, which should appear in the order that the candidates were written on their code sheet. And the assumption is that if those preference codes were written in the correct order, relative to what's on the code sheet, then their vote must have been correctly recorded by the authorities. Because nobody else who was ignorant of the order of the candidates on the code sheet could have rearranged the preferences to match what's on the secret order that's on the code sheet. If that didn't make sense, here's a slow and careful example. Okay, so here's what the code sheet, there's two code sheets now, right? There's the voting code sheet with one code for each candidate, and then there's the preference code sheet with one code for each preference. So suppose you want to vote checkered, fuzzy, green, red again. You just send off the codes in exactly the obvious order. You know, the code for checkered, the code for fuzzy, the code for green, the code for red. Okay, so here comes the complicated bit. Now we want to figure out what preferences, what acknowledgement codes we should get in what order. So now we've sent off our vote codes, forget about the vote codes. We want to check that the preferences came back right. Well, the red candidate, who's going to be first on the list, was our fourth preference. So we expect the preference acknowledging code from the fourth preference acknowledging code down here, right? A green candidate was our third preference, so we expect the third preference acknowledging code. The checkered candidate was our first preference, so we expect the first preference acknowledging code, and fuzzy was second, so we get the second. And again, the big assumption is that these candidates were listed in a random order. So if my client machine wanted to rearrange the vote codes, which it certainly could have done, it could easily have rearranged the vote codes as I sent them off. But if it wanted to return to me the preference acknowledging codes in the correct order, it would have to know the order that the candidates were listed on my sheet. So that's kind of the idea. Yeah.
Would it work the other way around if the ACT codes were associated with candidates and it had to return you the ACT codes in preference order?
That's an interesting idea. If it had to return you the ACT code in preference order. Quite possibly. So that could be just sort of the dual of the same thing. Let me think about that for a second. So you're saying, do I still have random candidate codes on my...
So each candidate gets a random candidate code and acknowledgement code.
Yeah.
And then it just returns to you the candidate acknowledgement codes in preference order.
Let me see. So the attack that I wanted to defend against...
in the order listed on your ballot. Sorry. The preferences in order listed on your ballot.
Let me think about that for a minute. So the attack that I want to defend against is the attack where your client machine flips a couple of your preferences, or flips a couple of your vote codes, waits for the acknowledgements, and then does some kind of predictable rearrangement to make it look plausible on the way back. And you're saying...
yeah, they have to, but so the return thing has to return them in the order that the candidates are listed on your ballot. So now your client has no way of knowing where that is and doesn't know which ones to swap.
Which is which. So you're saying, so I could send off all my codes and it would give me my preferences back. I think I have to think about that offline.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to meet the timing constraints here.
It's just that when you put up this example, I was trying to compute what to me was the obvious, like, oh, it's totally, and then I realized, oh, it's the other way around. But
come and ask me again after the talk,
Okay.
because I'll be able to think when I've sat down. I can't think right now.
That's okay. That's hard.
But yeah, I'm almost done anyway.
If the ballot is as big as Australia, what you really need is a numbered list, because nobody can tell row 36 from row 37 on a 75 candidate list.
I know. I mean, the truth is, for a ballot as big as Australia, I've really come to the conclusion that you just have to give up on the client not knowing how you voted, unfortunately. Because the UI problem of trying to put that many people in order is just too hard. Even if they're sitting in front of you, it's too hard. So after working on this for a long time, I kind of came to the conclusion that actually, for a huge kind of ballot like that, it doesn't work. All right, I'm done. I think we've already talked about the integrity and privacy of that. The whole idea is that I think we've described why your client can't swap a couple of your codes and then swap the preference codes on the way back. So here's my conclusion. Manipulating democracy is an ancient art, beginning with the Greeks and really continuing in more and more sophisticated form to the present day. Attackers are often insiders. If the people who are running the system have the opportunity to mess with the vote, then sooner or later somebody who wants to mess with the vote will make sure they get a job running the system. Electronic systems, at least at first blush, offer more opportunities for undetectable manipulation. One might also hope that we could use nifty crypto to provide a higher degree of verifiability, but certainly the way things are going at the moment, the opportunity for really widespread undetectable fraud is increasing as electronic voting, as electronic voting increases. PGD does a pretty decent job of addressing many of the threats. It's a decent trade-off among the different security properties that you might ask for. But there are a lot more features that you would want to add before you fielded it in a real election. You'd want a much stronger form of coercion resistance, and you'd want to deal with this issue of the secrecy of the code sheets being both hard to achieve and necessary for integrity. There you go. Done. Yeah.
So how does
There's sort of an old idea in these voting systems to deal with coercion resistance, which is have some dummy codes that you can submit. So can't you get like a random number of dummy sheets and one real sheet? So someone says, hey, I want your sheets here, right? I'll give you my dummy sheets. When those get tallied, the talliers just give you the ACK and drop it on the floor.
Yeah. There are certainly lots of systems with that kind of thing in mind, and I kind of half believe it, if you know what I mean. At some kind of technical level, I believe that it works, but there are a couple of things about it. One, it's very hard to maintain the same verifiability that that you get from just having one code sheet. Not always, but for example, the Norwegian system that allows re-voting only really does so at the sacrifice of getting a proof that the thing that you meant to cast really was the thing that was actually counted for you. I'm not saying that's an inherent problem. I'm just saying that when you start doing that kind of thing, it starts getting hard to make sure that the thing you thought was your real code sheet really was actually your real code sheet, and all the things that you thought were dummies really were dummies. So it's not necessarily a fundamental problem, it's just one more thing that needs to be thought through. The other thing is, the main thing that I don't like about those kinds of schemes is the user interface issue of those schemes. Like, how would you actually produce for an ordinary group of voters one code sheet that was clearly enough the real code sheet that they'd remember which was which when they got home, but that for which the coercer wouldn't be able to figure out which was which? Even if you could deliver it in a secure, even if you could sit them down in a room and say, nobody else is allowed to come into the room, I'll explain to you which one the real code sheet is.
If you're going to do that, you may as well have them vote right then and there.
That's possibly true too.
Of the remote voting.
No, because you usually want to separate the people who give the code sheets from the people who tally the votes, so they can't link it to you.
But the whole purpose of this is to allow large-scale voting without any human-to-human interaction between the authorities and the voters, right?
That would certainly be a good feature. Although there might still be something to be said for secure registration 6 weeks before the election and then remote voting on polling day or something like that. I don't know.
If you're going to do secure registration, you might actually vote then.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that too. I agree. I guess all I'm saying, I was still just trying to come back to the different credentials kind of question and say, I'm just not sure how well it would actually work. That's all. Not that I see something fundamentally wrong with it, but that I've never really seen a complete description that I'm convinced would solve the problem. Anybody else?
Good. Thank you.